In the spring of 1789, King Louis XVI called a meeting of the Estates General, convinced his financial reforms would save France from economic collapse. Within 4 years, he was dead, guillotined in front of a cheering crowd, and France had descended into chaos that would consume a generation. This wasn't an accident or an isolated incident of political violence. It was the predictable outcome of a cycle that has repeated itself across centuries, cultures, and continents with disturbing precision. From the streets of Paris to the halls of the Winter Palace in St. Petersburg, from the casinos of Havana to the corridors of power in Washington, D.C., the same pattern emerges. When you understand the 6-stage cycle of revolutionary collapse, you can identify exactly where society stands on the timeline between prosperity and upheaval. Right now, the United States is demonstrating every characteristic of Stage 4, and if history is any guide, what comes next will reshape American life in ways most citizens cannot yet imagine. The 6-stage revolutionary cycle isn't a theory invented by modern historians or political scientists. It's a pattern distilled from actual historical events, identified by examining the common elements that appeared before, during, and after every major revolutionary collapse in the modern era. Stage 1 begins with fiscal irresponsibility at the governmental level, typically driven by expensive foreign wars or imperial overreach. Stage 2 introduces monetary debasement, where governments attempt to solve debt problems by debasing their currency through printing or borrowing. Stage 3 manifests as a loss of public trust in institutions, particularly financial and governmental authorities. Stage 4 arrives when wealth inequality reaches extremes, and the middle class begins its collapse under the weight of taxation and inflation. Stage 5 is marked by political fragmentation, where traditional power structures fracture and radical movements gain mainstream acceptance. Stage 6 is the revolution itself, which can take many forms, from violent overthrow to systemic collapse to military coups. Each stage creates the conditions necessary for the next stage to emerge. The progression isn't inevitable in every case, but the pattern has proven remarkably consistent across different cultures, time periods, and economic systems. Understanding this cycle requires looking beyond surface political narratives to examine the underlying economic pressures that drive social change. Money, debt, taxation, and wealth distribution aren't abstract concepts. They're the fundamental forces that determine whether societies remain stable or collapse into chaos. France in the 1780s was the most powerful nation in Europe, a center of culture and Enlightenment thinking. Yet by 1783, the French monarchy had accumulated debts totaling approximately 3.3 billion livres, roughly equivalent to 6 years of government revenue, primarily from financing the American Revolution and earlier European wars. King Louis XVI appointed a series of finance ministers who proposed reforms, but each plan foundered against the resistance of the nobility who refused to pay taxes. The First and Second Estates, clergy and nobility comprising less than 2% of the population, were exempt from most taxation, while the Third Estate, representing everyone else, bore the overwhelming burden. By 1788, France was spending approximately 50% of its annual revenue just on interest payments for existing debts. That same year, a combination of harvest failures drove bread prices to consume nearly 90% of a typical laborer's wages in Paris. When Louis XVI finally convened the Estates General in May 1789, he had no intention of surrendering royal power. He merely sought approval for new taxes to service debt, unaware that the economic pressure had already passed the point where modest reforms could relieve it. The tennis court oath of June 20th, 1789, marked the moment when the Third Estate declared itself the National Assembly. Within weeks, on July 14th, the Bastille fell, and the revolution had begun in earnest. What followed was predictable in hindsight. The initial moderate reforms of 1789 gave way to increasingly radical measures. The assignats, paper currency backed by confiscated church lands, were introduced in 1790 as a solution to the debt crisis. Within 4 years, the assignats had lost approximately 97% of their value through overprinting. The moderate Girondins, who initially led the revolution, were executed by the more radical Jacobins, who were in turn overthrown by the Thermidorian reaction. The directory that followed was so unstable and corrupt that by 1799, Napoleon Bonaparte seized power in a military coup. What began as a fiscal crisis in 1783 had, within 16 years, completely transformed French society, ended a 1,000-year-old monarchy, killed hundreds of thousands in political violence, and ultimately replaced democracy with military dictatorship. The Russian Empire in 1913 was experiencing an economic boom, with industrial growth rates exceeding 7% annually. Tsar Nicholas II ruled over approximately 175 million subjects across 1/6 of the world's land surface, and the Romanov dynasty had controlled Russia for over 300 years. Yet beneath this apparent stability, the cycle was already advancing. Russia's participation in World War I proved catastrophic. By 1917, the war had cost an estimated 30 billion rubles. roughly 10 times the government's annual revenue in 1913. To finance the war, the Russian government printed money aggressively, causing the ruble to lose approximately 50% of its purchasing power between 1914 and 1916. Simultaneously, the war diverted resources from agriculture and industry, creating severe shortages of food and consumer goods. By early 1917, bread prices in Petrograd had increased approximately 500% from pre-war levels. On March 8, 1917, International Women's Day, protests over bread shortages in Petrograd escalated into general strikes involving over 200,000 workers. Within days, military units ordered to suppress the protests instead joined them. Nicholas II abdicated on March 15, 1917, ending 3 centuries of Romanov rule, and a provisional government led by moderates took power. The provisional government's fatal error was continuing Russia's involvement in World War I. The Bolsheviks, led by Vladimir Lenin, promised peace, land, and bread, a message that resonated with soldiers and peasants far more effectively than the provisional government's commitment to honor Russia's wartime alliances. The October Revolution of 1917 was relatively bloodless, with the Bolsheviks seizing power in a coup involving fewer than 20,000 active participants in Petrograd. The subsequent Russian Civil War, however, lasted until 1923 and killed an estimated 8 to 10 million people through combat, disease, and famine. By the time the Soviet Union stabilized in the 1920s, Russia had transformed from an autocratic empire to a communist state. The economic crisis that began with wartime debt had progressed through all 6 stages in just 10 years. Cuba in the 1950s was one of Latin America's most prosperous nations, with a per capita income ranking 5th in the hemisphere. Havana was a glamorous destination for American tourists, with its casinos, hotels, and nightclubs, generating substantial revenue for the Cuban economy. Yet this prosperity was narrowly distributed. Approximately 70% of the land was owned by fewer than 10% of the landowners, many of them American corporations or Cuban elites connected to the Batista dictatorship. Rural poverty was severe. A 1956 Catholic university study found that 91% of rural children suffered from parasites, and only 11% of rural homes had electricity. In urban areas, unemployment ranged between 16 and 25%, depending on the season. Fulgencio Batista, who had seized power in a 1952 coup, ran a government notorious for corruption. American corporations paid substantial bribes to secure favorable treatment, while Batista and his associates diverted an estimated $300 million from government coffers during his 7 years in power. Fidel Castro's initial rebellion in 1953 failed badly, with Castro himself imprisoned. But economic conditions continued deteriorating, and public trust in Batista's government collapsed as corruption scandals multiplied. When Castro landed in Cuba with 82 fighters in December 1956, Batista's army quickly reduced his force to fewer than 20 survivors. Yet within 25 months, Castro had won the revolution, capturing Havana on January 1, 1959. This rapid victory was possible because Batista's government had lost legitimacy with virtually every sector of Cuban society. The middle class, business community, and even elements of the military turned against him as the economic situation worsened and corruption became undeniable. Castro initially promised moderate democratic reforms. Within 2 years, he had declared himself a Marxist-Leninist, nationalized all American-owned properties worth approximately $1.8 billion, and aligned Cuba with the Soviet Union. The transformation shocked many of Castro's original supporters, but by that point, Stage 6 had arrived. The economic crisis that began with wealth inequality and corruption had progressed through loss of institutional trust, middle-class decline, and political fragmentation, ultimately producing a communist dictatorship that would last over 6 decades. The United States entered Stage 1 of the revolutionary cycle at the beginning of the 21st century. The September 11 attacks of 2001 triggered a series of military interventions that would ultimately cost American taxpayers an estimated $8 trillion, according to Brown University's Costs of War project. These wars coincided with expanding domestic spending. Federal spending increased from approximately 18% of GDP in 2001 to peaks exceeding 31% during crisis years, while revenue remained relatively stable, around 17-19% of GDP. The national debt, which stood at approximately $5.7 trillion in 2001, surpassed $34 trillion by late 2023. More significantly, the debt-to-GDP ratio increased from about 55% to over 120% during this period, entering territory historically associated with sovereign debt crises. Stage 2, monetary debasement, arrived in full force following the 2008 financial crisis. The Federal Reserve's balance sheet expanded from approximately $870 billion in 2007 to over $8.9 trillion by 2022, as quantitative easing programs created trillions of dollars to purchase government bonds and mortgage-backed securities. The monetary expansion accelerated during the COVID-19 pandemic. In 2020 and 2021 alone, approximately 40% of all U.S. dollars ever created came into existence, according to Federal Reserve data. This massive monetary expansion produced predictable results. The Consumer Price Index increased approximately 20% between January 2020 and December 2023, with essential categories like food, energy, and housing showing even larger increases. Stage 3, loss of institutional trust, is measurable through polling data. Gallup's Confidence in Institutions survey shows that confidence in Congress fell to 8% in 2023, the lowest recorded level. Confidence in the Supreme Court dropped to 25% in 2023, down from 47% in 2009. Confidence in newspapers, television news, the criminal justice system, and public schools all reached historic lows during the same period. Perhaps most concerning is the decline in trust in the Federal Reserve and financial system. A 2023 University of Chicago survey found that only 32% of Americans expressed confidence in the banking system, down from 49% just 2 years earlier. Stage 4, extreme wealth inequality and middle-class collapse, is statistically undeniable. The Federal Reserve's own data shows that the top 1% of Americans hold approximately 32% of all wealth, while the bottom 50% hold roughly 2.5%. Real wages, adjusted for inflation, have stagnated for approximately 40 years for most American workers. The median American household in 2023 could afford less housing, healthcare, and education than the equivalent household in 1985, despite productivity more than doubling during that period. The middle class itself is shrinking. Pew Research Center data indicates that middle-income households declined from 61% of the population in 1971 to approximately 50% by 2023. Simultaneously, the cost of entering or remaining in the middle class increased dramatically. College tuition increased approximately 180% in real terms since 1980, while median family income rose only about 19%. Housing presents an even starker picture. The median home price to median household income ratio, which remained around 3.0 throughout most of the 20th century, reached approximately 5.8 by 2023, pricing millions of Americans out of home ownership. Stage 4 also includes the taxation burden on the productive middle class. When federal income taxes, payroll taxes, state taxes, local taxes, property taxes, and various fees are combined, middle-income earners face effective tax rates approaching 40-45%. Meanwhile, various tax advantages allow the wealthiest Americans to pay lower effective rates. ProPublica's analysis of IRS data revealed that the 25 richest Americans paid a median federal income tax rate of just 15.8% between 2014 and 2018, while many ordinary workers paid 25-35%. Stage 5, political fragmentation and radicalization, has already begun emerging in American politics. The traditional center that dominated American political life for decades is collapsing, replaced by increasingly polarized alternatives. In France, this stage manifested as the split between Girondins and Jacobins. In Russia, it appeared as the proliferation of political factions from constitutional Democrats to socialist revolutionaries to Bolsheviks, each offering more radical solutions than the last. In America, this fragmentation appears in several forms. Primary elections increasingly favor candidates with positions outside the historical mainstream of their parties, reflecting voter frustration with traditional leadership. Third-party and independent political movements are gaining traction despite institutional barriers. Trust in the electoral system itself has declined, with significant percentages of both major parties questioning election legitimacy at various times. The window between Stage 4 and Stage 6 typically ranges from 5 to 15 years in historical examples. France took approximately 6 years from the convening of the Estates General to Napoleon's coup, while Russia progressed from the February Revolution to Bolshevik consolidation in about 6 years as well. The exact trigger for Stage 6 is unpredictable. In France, it was harvest failures combined with fiscal crisis. In Russia, military defeat in World War I. In Cuba, a guerrilla movement that gained traction during economic stagnation. What remains consistent is that Stage 6 doesn't arrive because of the trigger event itself, but because the preceding stages have created conditions where any significant shock can collapse the existing system. The trigger is merely the spark. The stages create the powder keg. For the United States, potential triggers include another financial crisis more severe than 2008, a major military defeat or extended conflict, a currency crisis affecting the dollar's reserve status, or severe political crisis such as contested election results combined with economic distress. Stage 6 need not involve guillotines or firing squads to fundamentally transform society. Modern versions might include constitutional crises, military intervention in civilian politics, emergency executive powers. becoming permanent or de facto oligarchic control replacing democratic processes. The economic consequences would likely include severe currency debasement, possible transition to digital currency with government control, wealth confiscation through taxation or forced redistribution, capital controls preventing money from leaving the country, and nationalization of significant industries or assets. Historical evidence suggests that once a society reaches stage 5, preventing stage 6 requires extraordinary leadership, significant structural reforms, and usually external factors, such as economic booms from new technologies or resources. Modest policy adjustments typically prove insufficient to relieve the accumulated pressure. The most dangerous assumption in American society today is that systemic collapse cannot happen here. Every society that experienced the revolutionary cycle believed itself exceptional, protected by its wealth, culture, military power, or unique system of government. The French aristocracy believed divine right and thousand-year tradition made revolution impossible. The Romanovs thought their secret police and military power would preserve their empire indefinitely, even as soldiers mutinied in Petrograd. Batista's government was confident that American support and military superiority would overcome a small band of guerrillas in the mountains. Each was correct about their strengths, but failed to understand that stage 4 creates conditions where traditional strengths become irrelevant. The United States possesses significant advantages that might slow or alter the cycle. Enormous natural resources, military capabilities, technological leadership, and reserve currency status provide buffers unavailable to previous examples. Yet these advantages may ultimately prove counterproductive if they create complacency about addressing the underlying economic pressures. France was Europe's dominant power in 1789, which provided no protection once the fiscal and social pressures exceeded the breaking point. The contrarian insight isn't that American collapse is inevitable or imminent. It's that the pattern is identifiable, the stage is measurable, and the historical precedents are clear enough that ignoring them constitutes willful blindness rather than rational optimism. Understanding the cycle provides a framework for recognizing early warning signs and understanding which reforms might interrupt the progression. Fiscal responsibility, monetary stability, institutional reform to rebuild trust, and policies that strengthen rather than hollow out the middle class aren't merely good governance, they're requirements for avoiding stage 6. History suggests that societies rarely take preventive action until crisis forces change. The space between stage 4 and stage 6 is when intervention remains possible but politically difficult, requiring leaders to make unpopular decisions that won't show benefits for years. Whether American society possesses the foresight to interrupt this cycle before reaching stage 6 remains the defining question of our era. The pattern doesn't require any particular outcome, but it does reveal that the path we're on has a historically consistent destination. The revolutionaries in France, Russia, and Cuba didn't cause the collapses they participated in. They were symptoms of economic and social pressures that had built over decades, pressure that sought release through any available outlet, and ultimately found it in movements that promised to solve problems the old system could not address. The critical lesson from studying revolutionary cycles isn't about predicting specific dates or events. It's understanding that economic fundamentals, debt, currency, taxation, wealth distribution, create the conditions that determine whether societies remain stable or transform, whether that transformation is gradual reform or sudden collapse, and whether the new system that emerges represents improvement or merely replaces one form of dysfunction with another.